Chapter 2, the whys where we must begin. Do you know what I love about this chapter? I love launching in and realizing that God has a lot to say about sex. You read about it. The first conversation God ever had with man had to do about sex. All through Scripture, there's sexual narrative. We see Rahab, a prostitute, in the lineage of Jesus. We see the woman at the well. We see the adulteress to be stoned. Time and time again through Scripture, God used people with sexual baggage, sexual testimonies, people who knew sexual sin, were bound by shame, bound by guilt. He utilized their stories for his glory. And so I love that we can all sit back and relax and understand that God has a lot to say about sex. It's not taboo. It's not something we have to feel silent or nervous or shameful about. To talk about sex is to look more like the Creator who created it. I also really liked digging into the fact that in that first conversation God had with man, he married together two things: our inherent worth as creations, as image-bearing creations of God, and our call to sexual design and instruction. They've always been intended to stay side by side, to be interlocked. But we often unhinge the two. We're dehydrated of our worth. We don't know what God says about us. And so, therefore, we don't know why it matters to be obedient to what he said about sexuality and about sex. So I loved when I learned about those very things because they unified a lot for me. We're not just here. We're his. We are creatures made to worship, always intended to worship him, but we are also fallen creatures who choose for ourselves and have worshiped and idolized all different types of things all throughout the course of human history, sex being one of the biggest and most overwhelming. It's led to a lot of brokenness. The world has an ever-changing message, but the word is unchanging, never failing. It's been truth in the past, the present, and it will be truth until the day that Jesus returns. So which will you follow? Which will you lean into? You know, I mentioned the woman at the well, and we'll talk about her a little bit more later, but Jesus said, "You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know." So you've got to choose. Will you continue to worship the world, who doesn't even know itself, whose opinions are always changing? Or will we stand and worship the one we do know, who's never changing, and who has never changing truths that he blankets over sex? So here's some questions. Number 1, what does your church or other believers have to say about sex? How have you been talked to about sex? What's the conversation been like in your life so far? Number 2, why do you think we should even care about what God has to say about sex? Why does it matter? And number 3, why does it matter that we be obedient to his guidelines? Let's talk about that, and I'll see you in the next chapter.